Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on modern European philosophy, and specifically Barkley, for whom the town I'm in has been named and then consistently mispronounced for quite a long while. We'll get to that at the end of the lecture. It's actually Berkeley, I say as I look it over. I'm not the one to spell things out in my mind very well, as are none of my talents. It looks like Berkeley or Berkeley, yeah, Berkeley or Lie. And then it's sort of sounds like it should just be a Y at the end. But it's not pronounced that in either Irish or here. It is, for the Irish, Barkley, for us Berkeley, and it looks like Berkeley, but not pronounced that for either. George Barkley lived from 1685 to 1753. He was an Irish Anglican bishop and philosopher, and he is known today, of course, famously with the town I'm in and the university, my alma mater, and the surrounding town of what was North Oakland, effectively, until it split off in the 1800s, I believe. We'll get to that again in a bit of the history afterwards, because that all happened afterwards. Of course, the town couldn't be named for the guy, and was named after he had passed several years later. So Barkley was both an empiricist, along with Locke and Hume, but he's also an idealist, along with Kant. Leibniz is very much an idealist also. He has monads floating in space completely independent of each other, which is kind of ideal and kind of pure in a way. Leibniz is sometimes called an idealist, and I've heard him referred to as such, and thought, yeah, but not everybody calls Leibniz an idealist necessarily. Some call him a forerunner, but Barkley is consistently labeled an idealist. So we're going to talk about idealism right now, especially Leibniz is a bit weird. So this is very much idealism in modern European thought, starting with the Irish Anglican bishop. And that you then have Kant and Hegel are going to be idealists, but they're also of different camps that overlap in different ways. And we're going to look at Kant and Hegel as we walk through the stuff, because Kant and Hegel, the big two names where the big camps of analytic and continental philosophy split off with and after Kant, again, is what's going to be coming next. So Barkley is, again, like Leibniz, kind of a weird one. He's kind of an outlier. There's going to be a bit less of a lecture on him, certainly, than I have on Hegel. But he's important because he not only is really weird and interesting to cover, and of course all sorts of major philosophers who are weird and interesting to cover, thinkers and artists of all sorts of periods and cultures, are interesting in their lives and times, and then influence others, such that even minor figures have major important ideas that later become central to other more central thinkers. But Kant and Hegel are thinking of Barkley, the Irish guy, as they are coming up with their very German stuff, and then because they are, and they're idealists, later, as Kant and Hegel are famous and infamous for some, and then continue to be massively influential, Barkley only got known later as a guy who was massively important for Kant and Hegel. So we haven't gotten to Kant and Hegel yet, but as we do, this guy is important very much for them, and then for a lot of all of modern European philosophy afterwards. So idealism asserts that reality is, in a sense, mentally constructed. That could mean a lot of things, more or less objective world or not, but you have empiricism here as well, which is that reality is gathered more inductively than known deductively with rules, is more gathered through experience than it is deduced through rules, with all of that being complicated in the different empiricists. But as an empiricist and then also an idealist, Barkley is saying we gather our minds from our experience as far as what we know, but also that reality is very much constructed from our ideas, which, interestingly enough, kind of makes him a bit like the rationalist, but also somewhat not, because he is and isn't like Hegel and Kant here in saying, sure, we have pure reality, but that actually has to come in a certain sense from experience, that we fill in our pure ideal reality. And that really is what's going on here. What you're going to have is the rationalists already, like Descartes and others, Spinoza. They think that there's pure deductive principles, and they're arguing for that. Empiricists rock back against that, and they say, Hume being the boldest, that really there's just rough experience. What else is there? But Hume does not give us much of a system or much ideal categories at all, in the slightest. You might as well say everything just piles up into piles in our minds and then be done with it and not really have a system. Now, I like Wittgenstein, so actually with that I would say, yeah, but then you have to go show how there's forms of life in the world, and you can debate all that. But for empiricists here, and for others, how do we have such pure things like 2 + 3 = 5 if Hume is right and we're just sort of showered with experience? Why does it seem like 2 + 3 simply equals 5 so much? Is that just an accident for us and the Chinese, or is that more essential? Well, the way it is we have Locke's blank slate is what I meant to say. And I will only say what I mean, yes, and nothing else. For the idealist, how do we get 2 + 3 = 5? And Kant and Hegel have different answers from Barkley. In fact, Barkley is going to say it's the consistent dream of God, and that's all his idea, which is not what neither what Kant nor Hegel say, although they don't entirely deny that. But they're not saying it like that. We're just in the dream of God, man. That's it. But actually, our ideal reality, and this is a very important idea for a bunch of philosophy that's going to follow, and actually even gets into things like structuralism, post-structuralism, and postmodernism. For that, at least, Barkley is not the most Berkeleyan of guys of this town, but insofar as he says our ideal reality is constructed out of our messy experience, actually he very much still is, and is still thus a bit postmodern almost, although he certainly isn't much of that, even in his day. But we get our ideal reality from our messy experience because that's how our minds make it. Now, that actually is a very important idea, which will continue to go on, and that is kind of the merging of rationalism and empiricism in Barkley, and then Barkley and Kant and Hegel's idealism. So for the idealists, our reality is constructed out of our accumulated ideas. That's what Hume says. However, just as Descartes gave the Cartesians and rationalists certainties to fight for, without a satisfactory argument to account for them systematically, Hume gave the more empirically minded a new, open, and evolving picture of the mind, without providing a system to account for how we come to structure reality as we do. Now, eventually, just to cheat and turn to the last page, in Wittgenstein, I'm going to say it's forms of life we live in and outside of us all together in circuit. And that's where it very much is. And that's where we're going to end up. But for Hume, of course, it's more piles in the mind. And for Barkley and these other folks, it's still very much what's going on in the mind. And it's later thought that's going to set this, Hegel and afterwards, socially out in the world a lot. It's not that these guys aren't referring to things socially out in the world, of course, but there is a much more emphasis on Hegel and then later German thought and French thought and social sciences in our world and the art you see and all sorts of things, that reality is constructed out of our experience. I do like to imitate Hannibal Lecter, who is evil philosopher. He's actually evil Stoic, evil Aristotle, and goes back and forth and doesn't conform to their standards, nor does he try, which is why he's sort of teasing Clarice. And he says, do we idealize what we don't see? He's like, no, we start with what we see every day. And that was very much that I see people and then I come up with ridiculous fantasies out of what I see every day or something like that, as far as sexuality or what have you, or yeesh, even worse. So for all of this, it's very much we get our reality from our mothers, fathers, friends, enemies, everybody around us, and then we idealize beyond that what is real. That's a huge bunch of stuff. That is very much what Barkley is helping send off. And of course, funny enough, this town is perfect for all of that. Plenty. Judith Butler is all over that. And apparently she is perhaps still the highest paid person in this town, which again, much love. And yeah, that's still a very Berkeley thought. But of course, Barkley wasn't trying to give that to hippies or Berkeley. And that all took a very odd route, as we'll talk about here. Barkley was born in the Barkley family castle in the Kilkenny, you killed Kenny, you bastards, a la South Park, in the Kilkenny County of Ireland. He attended and then became a lecturer at Trinity College of Dublin. As I like to mention, first, 1,000 years ago, William decided to, not stay home and sack Rome instead. And so, or I guess that would be some ways off. But yeah, effectively, that 1,000 years ago, have the effectively something like the Anglos and the Saxons and the Brits, and then you have Oxford, and then soon after, a couple hundred years, you have Cambridge. I think like 1300. It's around like Oxford is around 1,000 something. Cambridge is like 1300s. And then the third major university college to be added to Britain was added as Trinity College of Dublin. And again, this is back in a time, of course, last 1,000 years when there's fewer colleges and stuff. So actually, like the third big place to learn anything in the British Isles. And now all that's been going on for the last 1,000 and then especially the last 500 years. In 1710, Barkley published his central text, an essay concerning the principles of human knowledge. His primary target for criticism was Locke, whom we've already talked about, and you should check out that lecture, and my favorite new cat brain, which I still occupy entirely. Excuse me. And Locke's distinction, Barkley attacks, between the objective primary qualities and subjective secondary qualities. Now, I already laid out a bunch of an attack on that. In fact, I started swinging as soon as I started talking about Locke, because I'm trying to lock it down. And then I just keep going, and then at the end I definitely end with, and how much does this draw a line? It doesn't. Well, that's amazing. Well, Barkley is very much thus, oddly as I stand in this town, and we'll sit down and possibly lie down and deal with later, is that we really haven't managed to separate completely objective from the subjective entirely in life and everything. As mathematical as things continue to be, again, it's very possible no one in America knows, even the people involved, how much anyone's building helicopters in America. It's very possible. Not because we're terrible or it's a conspiracy, just because that sort of thing would not be anything any particular individual can actually know fully. Which is hilarious because it doesn't mean math isn't involved in helicopters. So how much more should we quantize all of this? Well, a bit more perhaps, but for what purpose? And I don't know. It's hard too. It's hard to say whether or not we're more or less objective or subjective, and that's a lot of discussion of philosophy. That's the kind of stuff I love. Some people hate and ignore. I love to get into all of that and everything you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner table, nicely, with every kind of person. So we really haven't separated objective from subjective truth yet plenty, although this is exactly the debates, as Hegel will say soon in a couple of talks here. I will say for him. Probably in 1 or 2 talks. I'll probably need at least 2 to cover Hegel. But Barkley is attacking the distinction of Locke between objectivity and subjectivity. I've already been attacking, and again, I stood up for Locke and say, no, I mean, he's amazing. He should take his place in history. Unfortunately, it's a bit colonial here, as we're going to get to right here. Locke and Barkley both, as we'll just cover right here. But yes, still, in spite of all of the triangles and the trades and the slaves, again, objective from subjective still remains the raging debates. And actually, that's what we're going to cover too. And I do see that my stuff on postmodernism often gets more views than other things. Eventually, again, I will talk out all the postmodernists, and I do hope that helps people think and see why you don't have to agree or disagree with any of these theorists, but they are pointing out aspects of your world that we do talk about and think about and are highly debated then. So if you want to enter into the debate or see more of your world, why not? Here, the major idea, again, to carry away right here is especially what is our mind and reality if we learn our principles and they're always cobbled together, our ideal reality, whether or not this is so godlike or the dream of God, entirely all of this here. We've already gone with Spinoza plenty back and forth. How is that if we gather it through our subjective experience? And here Barkley just dead ends this somewhat, not in the dead, but in the living whole mind of God as reality, which is nice. Unfortunately, kind of like Descartes, that believes in God and anchors it in that, it doesn't really give you many moving pieces beyond that to then start doing other work that others like Kant and Hegel will do, while also being theists, clearly, and then thinking, well, let me show you more moving parts of things than that after I've read Locke and Barkley, specifically. Hume, Locke, and Barkley, clearly Locke, Hume, and Barkley, specifically, are going to lead to a lot of these Brits, a wave of German thought in Kant and Hegel, along with others, and then, yes, this is at a time when these people could not teach in each other's universities because they were the wrong kind of person and Christian, by the way. Wrong kind of white people, let alone, anybody else. So yeah, all of that is very much history and context and interesting. What I mean here is specifically that I know that 100 years later, Lewis Carroll would not be taught by German Lutherans ever in Britain or at Oxford. But in all of that, still at the same time, the Germans are going to get stuff from these British empiricists, and we're going to have Locke and Hegel and get seriously into German thought after we first had Leibniz. And those will be added to the playlist and the lectures very soon. And then after the Germans, a bunch of French people, which is postmodernism, post-structuralism, and a whole lot of fun, and tears and pain, and then it's time, not so existential, but more postmodern, to laugh again, I would say, and I will say, at the time. Several times, actually. I'm going to make a bunch of terrible jokes about it. But back to Barkley and where I never left here. So, in 1728, Barkley married and traveled to America. Yay! He bought a plantation, boo, unfortunately named Whitehall, double boo, in both the White and the Hall, in Rhode Island. I'm just going to leave that one alone. But after he failed, is there enough to boo in Rhode Island? I've never been. Perhaps there, maybe there's nothing much. But after he failed to secure funding from Britain, he returned to London. While in America, he planned on setting up an ideal. He's an idealist, yeah. Get it? Get it? Huh? You get it? Ideally, yes. He set up an ideal city and a college in Bermuda, a plan that never materialized. Again, because he is actually very much as an idealist, the anti-materialist. He actually does argue there is no such actual thing as material. It is all in the mind, which we're going to get to. It makes him weirdly like Leibniz, but very much not also, because we're not monads secretly in space, unknowingly. It's the just mind of God out here, not we're all tucked away in monads. Barkley's works were unpopular in his lifetime, and they remained so until the mid-1800s, when new scholars shed light on his work as a precursor, again, and saw an inspiration to idealist Kant and Hegel, whose work was then, in the 1800s, dominating the intellectual scene. Kant is later 1700s, and I believe he dies right around 1800. I will look up the dates again, and we'll go over those. Hegel is writing some of his major works in the earliest of the 1800s, and then Hegel, I think, dies in 1835 about, at a younger age, could have lived longer, written more works, wrote a heckload, but died decently young of disease and plague, actually. But by that time, and then in the mid and then late 1800s, Kant and Hegel are very serious for a lot of people, because by that time, Kant and Hegel have caught on. After both of their deaths, a couple of decades a bit. They were popular in their day in their neighborhoods, but they started in their cities, but they, at their places of teaching and other things, but they started to move, again, their reputations outward. Actually, again, Hegel taught. We'll go over Kant and Hegel's lives more carefully than I am here when we get there. Excuse me again. In 1866, when the first University of California was founded just north of Oakland, a group of students stood watching ships head out to sea through the Golden Gate 70 years before there would be a bridge. So the Golden Gate, as in the bay opening, yay bay, and there was no Golden Gate Bridge, but there was the Golden Gate in the opening. So one of the students, there was an opening for a bridge. So one of the students, Frederick Billings, who would go on to be the president of the Northern Pacific Railway, and a trustee of the university, which means his character was beyond reproach, I'm sure, if you know anything about Western United States history during that era. He was quite a character, I'm sure, in the community. Was reminded of a quote from the final stanza of George Barkley's Verses of the Prospect of Planting Arts and Learning in America. And he said to his fellow folks standing up on Founder's Rock, it is said, that westward the course of empire takes its way. So Billings was actually saying here that he was having pride in European colonialism, continuing to reach out and Christianize Asia and get control of the world. So, of course, that, funny enough, it's not very Berkeley to say, let's send Western culture around the world, and continue to colonial, it's very post-colonial, as I like to joke, and we'll get to post-colonialism, because we're going to get to French thought. It's like, it's very post-colonial to not be into post-colonialism, but to hate it, because, of course, post-colonial times are actually very colonial and then continue to be so, which is post-colonialism. Feminists, I joke, like feminism. Post-colonialists don't like post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is bad. Post-colonialists study the bad. It's kind of like criminologists don't like crime. I mean, they like the subject, and they study it, but criminologists don't like crime, and post-colonialists don't like post-colonialism, and that's because of what Barkley's all about right here with plantations in Bermuda, And so when Billings, effectively like 100-ish years later says, westward the course of empire takes its way out of the Golden Gate, of course he means let's continue to have white man's burden spread around the world and spread the culture, that's superior and Christian, which of course, hilariously, and most controversially, is not what this town is very much about in its idealism. A lot of people would accuse Berkeley of being idealistic, wouldn't they? Very few on the left or right would accuse them of idealizing, purely and consciously colonialism, although I'm sure plenty of people would, both left and right, accuse them of supporting colonialism unconsciously in spite of that. But, of course, I'll leave that for everyone else here. We're still talking about Barkley. I did say that part gets at the end. Apparently, again, it's not at the end, it's right here. We have yet to talk about Barkley's thought. Billings basically suggested that the community, which at that time was just North Oakland and thriving as such, which was already a thriving town at the time. And again, I do believe that there's roots, of history of many different communities, including the black community, in Oakland at the time, as in the 1800s, and all of that in San Francisco, etc. And again, there's good history and work on all of that. That, of course, as they're separating off North Oakland, they are, of course, separating off what is then becoming the essentially university town. So the name, again, is actually inspired more by the colonialism, perhaps, than even the idealism, although perhaps the colonialism is here plenty idealistic. While Kant and Hegel, who are both idealists like Barkley, argue that our reality is mentally constructed. And so the shape of our world and reality is necessarily the shape of our mental constructions. Neither denied the existence of the material world, so Barkley is more extreme than Kant and Hegel are going to be after him. Kant and Hegel say we don't purely know the world in itself. I'm going to leave that to itself. I'll mention that a time or two here against Barkley. But essentially, Kant and Hegel do say our mind is our reality. The Zen say all is mind. Very much so. The wall that you're looking at, whatever you're looking at, you yourself, this feeling, you imagining this feeling and me feeling this feeling, in a certain sense, all is mind, and then there is what we perceive as objects outside of us, our feelings. In a certain sense, this is all our mind, brain, spirit, reality, all of that. In fact, if you do say this is all God, pantheistic or panentheistic, you would be saying something like all is mind. So when the Zen, of course, most cynically and one could say now, psychologically, after the Germans of the 1800s, like Kant, Hegel, and then others starting to use psychology as a word after them, because of them and others, we can say all is very much mind. So in fact, in a certain sense, we all agree to that plenty-ish, let's just say, not entirely. There's lots of controversy. And whether or not there's a separate objective pure world, or pure data, or stuff. That's going to come up. Russell thinks there is pure data, aside from the subjective. But Kant and Hegel don't deny that there is the world itself. In fact, Kant says we can't know it. Hegel accuses Kant of saying thus he's denying it. Kant technically, as many point out, doesn't entirely deny it. He just says we don't have, very much like Hegel. They both do agree. We do not have a world itself. We have the tree falling in the forest. It makes a sound when we are there, and it makes a sound. So sound is what you hear through the ears and the mind. It isn't purely just there. It is in circuit with, at least, or is part of mind. We all decently agree to that. Let's not haggle over whether or not, yes, this or that yet, because, of course, we're moving on to the differences of Barkley and these guys. Barkley is taking idealism as the first sort of major idealist. Leibniz is already extreme. We already had Leibniz, and check that out. Of course, he thinks we're all monads in space, which is very weird. And he's sort of denying, very much again like Parmenides, that the world is much at all. Like we sort of see it, which is weird and quite ideal rather than one could say realist or realistic, perhaps. Even if that's not in a specific camp. Barkley is taking idealism to a much greater extreme than Kant and Hegel would in being an immaterialist. There aren't many immaterialists. Barkley is saying this is all, knock, 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 this is all the mind of God. So, in a certain sense, this is all dream mind, like the most physical of reality. What Barkley is actually saying is this. The snapping of my fingers is actually, this is a thought of God, this physical reality right here, which is why it's more real than my imagining the finger snap. Watch this. Yeah? What Barkley would say in a certain sense is if you imagine and don't hear, I said watch. Did you not hear? Good, you watched. You didn't hear either. So as I set you up to not hear, Barkley would say, well, that not hearing or anything is just as real as, say, the pan. It's all thought, but in a certain sense, your and my not hearing the snap is less real than this, right? So this is God's thought. And that's your and my thought, like something should be there. In a certain sense, like I can imagine a zebra, and it's like Hume says, the impression is weak. The impression is stronger than the idea. I don't know if I stressed that point enough last time. Hume very much says that, and it should have been the time before as the first Hume lecture, of course, that what we see, our perceptions are stronger than our ideas, which is kind of why the ball disappears and kind of is sort of there and then sort of fades out as the magician palms the ball, as I discussed with Hume. Barkley thinks all of this is the mind of God, so he actually argues. He argues and decides that there is no such thing as independent substance of mind. Now, that is actually weirdly like the Zen. He actually is arguing. What he is saying is that if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, it does not make a sound. A dog whistle does make a sound for a dog, but a dog whistle doesn't make a sound for you at all. So in a certain sense, that's not real for you right then. And in that way, what he's actually saying is the tree only exists if God or we are looking at it or hearing it. If God or we are not hearing the tree, it does not exist then. Now, the way he kind of cheaply gets out of this, which is very easy to say, he sort of doesn't answer the question about how much of the world God is supplying us. So, of course, he doesn't actually answer, and he technically has to be agnostic about whether or not the tree exists. He's not being so agnostic about God here. He's being quite theistic, but insistently. But what he means is, of course, it's like, well, if God wants the chairs to be in the classroom, I usually say in a classroom, haven't been this semester, during the plague, again, that may have taken Hegel or not. But it's, again, was he properly vaccinated? Probably not. It's all of that pastured him by. But essentially, and the band played on, as I shall right here. Essentially, the trees don't exist, but then God can kind of make the chairs exist in the classroom after everybody goes home and turns the light off. So he kind of doesn't answer. He's kind of not saying they blip out of existence. But what he is saying here, we can say, effectively for you and I, when we leave a classroom or I leave my apartment and I stop thinking about it, all of that blips out of existence and may or may not exist to God. If you ever look at three-dimensional video games, they sometimes have videos of the making of it where they pull back and they can kind of show you what the character is seeing and then actually what the game is constructing. I don't have a good video of that right here on the website or showing. But if you've ever seen something like that, you know what I mean when I say the video game isn't actually constructing everything all the time. It's only really constructing what you look at. And that's also, we have good reason to believe that's like the brain. So all of this stuff, of course, is important for history and psychology, no matter what you believe. All of these angles are, and no matter what we believe or disbelieve about the ideas. That's why I love the history of them across cultures. Being an immaterialist is kind of like, somewhat like when you see a video game, and the video game is only making what the character is looking at. In fact, if you play video games online with people, my friend told me his 8-year-old daughter easily figured out how to play Splatoon online with her friends, like during the thing. It's like, well, that's amazing to me. And heck, it's a wonderful, crazy, interesting world out there, isn't it? As long as it's Splatoon, sure. Is that, as far as all that, it's the video game world, of course, even if you're playing online with other people, your computer is not necessarily figuring out everything that they're seeing in their perspective. Their console, their computer is figuring out what they're seeing, but your computer is just representing them as a point in space easily, and then their computer's working overtime to represent their perspective. You never have to see their perspective. You just have to sort of have your perspective and imagination and then project it into them. So the video game just has to sort of show you the mountains where the mountains are, kind of, and then everything else is blurry, and then the most distinct buildings fill in. And you can kind of see if you pull back. Again, I wish I had a good link. I've seen things like this. I'll try to find something simple like this that's not obscene and full of questionable dialogue. If you pull back, is that, yes, it's the video games, is that you pull back, and of course it's not really all filled in. That is kind of what Barkley is suggesting it could be, but again, he just sort of cheats, and it's like, well, maybe God just, because if God's omnipotent, why not just create the whole dang chairs all the dang time? You know what I mean? And then, of course, you could argue that, the chairs never blip out of existence until we destroy them. That would just take time and memory, I guess, oddly enough, processing for the Lord Jehovah here. And so, again, knock, 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 is like, well, Essentially, it's like, well, that is the substance of God's ideas, which is why they're actually realer than your and my memories of the knock or going outside and thinking about a chair or two. That's actually what Barkley's arguing. It's incredible. And again, it actually does fit with the Zen and a lot of other stuff. It also is not what Kant and Hegel are going to say. Effectively, they are saying, no, you only get your reality from your experience. So yes, yeah, but they would just, again, here, like Barkley kind of cheaply does, they're just going to avoid being immaterialist, though, as Barkley is explicitly, and say, we're not going to argue. Of course, substance is only substance as and when you experience it. Yes. But we're not even going to try, to deny that the tree isn't there when it falls and you're not around and don't hear it. That's basically what they're going to do. So that's the way they're going to handle all of that. And so he is a major influence on them, but basically Barkley goes too far. So in this way, he is a bit like Leibniz, who denied the genuine existence of anything other than the infinite set of monads. And he's a bit like Zhuangzi, my favorite Chinese Taoist, one of my favorite, if not favorite, Chinese philosophers, period, who refers to reality as the great dream, and also, much like it makes him, Barkley, like Descartes, remember, the deceiving demon, even though technically Descartes actually disproves all that, of course, and is actually trying to say, but God isn't lying to me about the world, therefore this isn't the dream of a demon. Again, technically, perhaps Descartes does not explicitly say, but this is not just the dream of God, though, but he is sort of implying this can't just be Satan Earth deception. It is truthful Earth of God, Descartes says. So that does sound like Descartes is implying there's a physical world outside the mind of God, but Descartes could be lumped into this, and he didn't, I don't read over Descartes all the time. I'm not sure each and every way that he cast it, but I do think maybe Descartes leaves himself open to this position, but I don't think he's arguing for it. I think he's arguing, no, the world, unlike the Gnostics, again, as mentioned with that, he doesn't think the world is all in a mind at all. Like Descartes is trying to say, no, this is a dead clock with the animals that pretend to be conscious down here for, kind of, there's real math down here is real clockwork, and that's not lies. That's actually God putting stuff for real down here. So again, Descartes does not follow this very explicitly at all. In fact, says a lot that doesn't seem in line with this. But he sets it all up with the deceiving demon that you would be thinking these kinds of thoughts, And again, there's plenty of that in Christian thought even before Descartes, of course, with parables and mysticism and all sorts of systems, etc. So as an immaterialist, Barkley argues that material things only exist in the minds of perceivers. Existence requires perception. It's a little proto-existentialist. Won't get into it here. At first, it may seem that Barkley is the only one who is dreaming, but there is at least some truth to his claim. Consider a table and the area around the table, which is an example I use all the time. If you say something is solid, again, like the hand, and you say, well, there's emptiness around it, in a certain sense, it's very easy to say, well, what is solid? And it's hard to say what solid just positively is, in particular. You then say, well, what is empty? This all has, air, dust, and light in it. And it's very easy to see the mind pops in positively and negatively, but what those positives and negatives are is what Derrida might say are presence and absence, with more of a French accent, of course, and in French. So not just the accent, perhaps not one. Though it would be a particular one, wouldn't it? Possibly individual and his own idiolect. Is that as we're popping in and out with mind, and I say, well, this is substance, knock, knock, what is it? Or, oh, there's absence. Well, what's absence? Which is most... And Diogenes says, I think you'll find the absence up here, Plato, you stupid idealist, which is criticizing idealism for something like immaterialism in the ancient Greek world. Our minds pop in and out of seeing solid as solid and empty as empty. So that actually does set us up, and I set up people all the time to show that the way your mind categorizes reality is and isn't real. And so in a certain sense, when you treat a table as an absolutely solid thing, you also treat a table as something you can jump on and then destroy. So in a certain sense, you treat a table unthinkingly as a yes, solid thing. You then can treat it as something we can modify or something that's only so solid and dense compared to another table. As I always like to joke, if anything was perfectly solid, we would all be gravitationally sucked into it, according to modern physics, and utterly created and destroyed anew. I'm not sure. I don't know much about the black holes and all of that. What I do know is that, everything is only so solid and dense, so our minds are very much, this is solid, this is good, this is bad. But then that oftentimes shows you mind. When you think something's good and then you think it's bad, you realize, oh wait, that was really how I was thinking about it. And so if I say, hey, the wall's solid, but I could launch you with a cannon through it, that is weirdly philosophical and quite humorous for me. Not you so much. Because of course we're testing reality and the limits quite physically here, although in our minds, safely, and in the imaginary immaterial world, along with Barkley here, and this town, very much, yes? A bunch of us. So, off in our minds here, in silly land, with abstract Wittgensteinian thought experiments, the weirder, the more involving aliens and unicorns, sometimes the better, you can very much see that mind is very much your reality, and solid and empty are very mental. Very. I'm just going to leave it at very. That's the nice, soft way of putting it. I'm not entirely carving it up here. In fact, with Wittgenstein, I would say, how dare you? But we can see there that the mind and solid, if what I'm arguing to you is what's solid physically is very mental, just leave me that. If you don't have to believe that, but if you are accepting that as the position of my argument here, then we're already a long ways towards Berkeley's immaterialism. Now, you may think that's wrong, but I would say psychologically that's very right. Whether or not you want to be right or wrong about it, I'd be like, well, what gives? We are very much like the most objective of our reality, and the solid of the solid is actually what we temporarily mentally think it is, and then we can see that as we think about it and change our minds. So that does with philosophy show us what seems to be solid turns out very much often to be empty. There's huge play on that throughout the material of the rest of the course, especially when we get to postmodernism, and they're making the biggest plays on this, which is how I then can frame all this plenty this new way for you. I'm not entirely a postmodernist, but I know how they're going to flip things inside out. So I know what moves are coming here. So I am showing you what moves there are here better, I hope, you know? So essentially, Barkley is actually saying stuff that is hugely important here. And it is very important for people like Kant and Hegel that when I knock on the table, that actually that's in my mind and shaped by my mind. Just leave it there, you know, because obviously there's a lot more technical we can get and a lot more, Wittgenstein would say, let's use a whole range of examples. And I am not here. In fact, I'm not using a range of examples because I'm keeping it as simple as these thinkers. And Wittgenstein is later going to be like, you really should use a range of examples here. Barkley really, I would say, does not. He uses a couple of examples like the apple. Barkley's example of the apple is very powerful. But I would say that Barkley doesn't use a huge range of examples here to show how varied this is. Rather, Wittgenstein might say, he uses few examples, as many thinkers do, to try to convince us his position's very solid. But what if we don't want just one solid position? We're trying to see the range of it. You get what I mean? I'm specifically not opening this up in a lot of ways. I'm going to let all of the thinkers as we're moving onward do specifically that, and I'm setting that out in front of you like that. What I'm doing right now is I'm saying Barkley uses the example of an apple and uses it well, and doesn't use a lot of examples, to say the apple is very much in your mind. And what he says, which is quite extraordinary, and I use this with Wittgenstein very much, and I love using the example of the apple. I did before I got back into reading this carefully for the lectures again, when I had to lecture about Barkley, which was years ago, and draw this up and then add to it. But he says something about an apple that's very true and quite extraordinary. I really love certain ideas in every thinker, even ones I disagree with, and Barkley I disagree with decently. But he says certain things that are amazing, like the chairs not existing in the room, or possibly yes, when we leave. And then he also says that, think of an apple. Now, it would be very interesting, he says, if when we imagine an apple, we imagine an apple from all sides, or we try to represent it as a mural with a bunch of trees and then seeds, and we try to parse it all out. And sure, as you think about an apple, you're going through imagination and all these other stuff. That's great. But if I say think of an apple, you imagine an apple as you would look at it with your eyes, right? Now, this is a very powerful empiricist point. If I ask you to imagine an abstract zebra, or I imagine you to imagine an abstract apple, I had the good fortune of taking two classes with Eleanor Roche, who came up with prototype theory and then taught Buddhist psychology because she could at Berkeley. And she came up with prototype theory very much, which is that you kind of have an image or a sort of standard bird in mind and imagination in ways, and let's just leave it loosely at that. So Very much you imagine an apple. If you always saw green apples, you'd see a green apple and always red or otherwise. You might often think of a red apple because you were shown very red iconic apples as a kid. Not even that there's only red apples, but because red apples, big and cartoonish, are something often shown to children. Oddly enough, the fake apple becomes more so the apple in your mind, which is very postmodern. We'll leave that hilariously to postmodernism. Sadly to existentialism, hilariously to postmodernism, with more cynical humor needed in the continuing situation. With the continued images and fakeness of the real and reality, of course, the hyper-real, with that image of Apple becoming Apple very much for you and I in more manufactured existence. But if I think of a red apple, I would think of an apple I would see, Clarice, that I would see every day. I would think about, okay, I have this apple in my life, and then I'm looking at it, and then I start to have an image of that kind of apple. Or if I'm raised in the Arctic, a bird is a penguin, as Eleanor Roche says. But it is kind of amazing when you stop and realize your mind makes the point that Barkley is making is very much the overall point that he shares with Kant and Hegel. Kant and Hegel are not immaterialists, but at the same time, Barkley's apple means that even in most abstract understandings, if I ask you to think abstractly about an apple, think about an example of an apple, and I want you to think most objectively about it, okay? I want you to think about mathematics, and I want you to think very objectively about it. You're going to start, Clarice, with what you see, most often, prototype theory of Roche, every day. You're going to start by looking at an apple as if you're looking at it from one side. Well, it's kind of interesting to think what we don't think here. Why don't you think about the apple from inside of it? Why don't you think about half an apple? Why don't you think about an apple from above it? Why aren't we taught to think about fruit from above them as if we are in a godlike position? Why don't we think about fruit from below it? Well, here, there could be all sorts of practices possible, but that's not important because you're just thinking about an apple as you would normally see it. So the point here about Barkley's, Barkley, I'm in Berkeley, Barkley's, I misspeak accordingly, apple is that in the same way that you would see an apple abstractly, this question's what abstract is, of course, in your mind, you're seeing a real kind of sort of paradigm prototype of an apple as you would very much in life from experience. We get our most abstract shape of reality from our everyday human experience, which is very empiricist, but also idealist, because you see the ideal apple very much the way you see, and you got it from real apples as you see them. If I am a straight male, I can assure you, and if I come up with weird fetishes, don't kink shame, about women, I would say start by what I see in women, and then I would abstract or get extreme in certain ways. Let's not all think about that. Let's seg back to safety of apples. That didn't start anything off, again, according to a bishop, back in the day. Did it? Nope. It's a completely, it's above board and above the belt, for all of that. Essentially, of course, if weirdness exists in our lives, people would have things they see. They would then abstract from that, and so that would be where politics and a bunch of other practices less pleasant, or more so, let's hope, come from. Because, and now as in this state, it is still legal to touch people in several different ways. The point being, of course, aside from all of my jokes and thinking that I'm funny, is, of course, with all of this sane and humorlessly, that basically we start with what we see every day. Our abstract ideal reality is abstract and ideal. This is very Zizek and postmodern. He's not exactly a postmodernist, but still hip postmodern thought in the Matrix would tell you, no, it is real. It just comes from a bunch of your ideal abstract reality comes from your real experience. That is a major thought, again, that's going to continue on through the class. There is a story opposed to Barkley's Idealism, often told, where Samuel Johnson, the famous English author and critic, that he reacted most famously to Barkley's immaterialist idealism. Samuel Johnson, was discussing Barkley with James Boswell while walking home after church on a Sunday morning. Back at a time when pretty much anybody in the community was expected to all go to the right, kind of church together. Johnson became quite upset at Barkley's denial of the independence of the material, his immaterialism, no, it doesn't exist apart from us. And so he walked over to a large rock, gave it a kick, and pronounced, "I refute it thus," which is a good refutation that also is and isn't one, of course. In a certain sense, pragmatically, no, we don't treat anything as immaterial. That is quite absurd to insist on the immaterial if the material's right there. Of course, what would Barkley say? He would say you didn't refute it thus, like you're here, so you're kicking it. God's here, you're here, it's here. That's not refuting him at all. Technically, he could just have God keep thinking of the rock, and then Barkley somehow has sonar, it's still there, but that would still be his sonar. So, again, or his video camera setup. So it doesn't really matter, and then Barkley's looking and Samuel Johnson's looking at the camera when he's looking at it. So whether it's the Ringu girl or not. So again, creepily, this is all ideal and real, and we start with what we see every day, and then that creeps us out entirely, like my sense of humor. So we do not treat life as if it is a merely subjective dream, any more than we treat others as if they are just figments of imagination in the mind of the solipsist, though. So yeah, there's all of that. There's a great Zen story that I do like, in which two monks are arguing. The master comes over and says, "What are you arguing about?" And a monk says, he's arguing that the monk is out there. I'm arguing the rock is in our minds, which means he's saying something like subjectivity without necessarily saying those syllables. Of course, probably not. And I'm saying that, and the monk says, I'm saying it is the Buddhist position that the rock is in my mind, which is very true, plenty. It is true that Buddhism is into subjectivity and the rock is, quotesy, in your mind. But as the master says, well, then it must be very hard for you to lift your head off of the floor every morning when you wake up if the rock is in your mind, to sort of judo throw the guy. And so, of course, it's in your mind, it's in the world, it's in circuit all over the place. I like Buddhism with Wittgenstein. And the rock is subjective is said rather objectively because it is in the mind, is in the world, and all of this back and forth. People think they have simple ins and outs here. They do, but then these keep going in ways. I already mentioned again, Diogenes heckles Plato most famously, where Diogenes picks up a cup, notes it's empty, and says, I hear that you say there's a form more perfect than the actual material cups, which is not necessarily Barkley's, because he is saying it's all ideal, altogether is real. And he says, so where's the emptiness? And then he says, I think you'll find it up here, Plato, as far as the form of emptiness, or what's ideal emptiness, what kind of form can that have? And then once people ask Diogenes, can you lead us to Plato and show us him? So he leads him out of town, points to the empty air, and says, may I humbly present you the great philosopher Plato, playing on the idealism and the immaterialism, of course. It's like, oh, you want to meet Plato or Barkley? Let me show you a bunch of empty air, possibly hot, and moving. Well, there you go. It's right there. And ain't it quite ideal in that it's quite empty, Barkley did not deny the existence of chairs or apples, but he argued, again, they're not material objects. They are, in a sense, mental objects, even as the real perceived object, which, honestly, here, I am somebody to swing much more subjective than most here, very, very much. And in fact, I don't draw a line, and I've already suggested Locke can't. It is kind of the thing, like, it's almost useless to push it this far, and I very much am saying it's almost useless to push, I think Wittgenstein would say, solipsism so far. We really never know if other people are like her, the computer phone, and if they're ever zombies or not, but we don't push it that far, nor could we. And it would almost be creepy, and we get in science fiction territory if we did. So it's actually not that we can prove Barkley wrong, or even prove that Thoth is or isn't real out there. It's more like we act like Barkley's immaterialism isn't really real, and that the chairs just hang out overnight. So honestly, but it's very interesting to go through the position and actually admit that you cannot defeat solipsism or Barkley's immaterialism. I would say, but then again, I would be contradicted and others would argue and do otherwise. I would say, actually, these are interesting pieces. You will find them through postmodernism and Wittgenstein. But after reading through this, many aren't satisfied with Barkley, and then we get a bunch of people aren't satisfied with Kant and Hegel, and a bunch of other unsatisfactory people, the Germans, at least unsatisfactory and not revolutionary enough in their own minds, as we'll get rather pessimistically as we go along. So we'll actually get to Kant's thing in itself. Hegel criticizes Kant, and he says Kant says you can't know the thing in itself. That pretty much is what Barkley's arguing. Hegel then criticizes Kant, and some say unjustly, and says Kant thinks there's a thing in itself you can't know. No, there isn't. This is the thing in itself. Me having a mental physical experience is the only thing I know is real. So this is mental physical, and that's real, is what Hegel says. In a certain sense, all of this is kind of different shades of very much splitting hairs of the same thing, of course. In a certain sense, Barkley is saying this is the only real I know. It doesn't exist materially at all, independent of that, of this. What Kant is saying is I can't know the real this in and of itself. He doesn't actually say whether or not that's independent of this, so therefore there's this, and I categorize this mentally and experience it also, altogether, as the interaction of all that he describes and he cuts up. Hegel, in taking up the way Kant cuts up all of this, then says Kant's wrong because there is no bare thing in and of itself. The subjective is the objective from different angles. This is the subjective and objective, and Hegel has massive influence. As people paying attention, though, or playing along at home carefully say, in academia and elsewhere, technically, Hegel doesn't actually have Kant against the wall with you just said there's a bare thing in and of itself, because technically, like Hegel, Kant isn't actually an immaterialist or even a materialist here. He's not saying there's a bare material objective existence, and he's not saying the world doesn't exist at all outside of our sight. He is agnostically ignoring all of that for the very reason that he doesn't want necessarily to be pinned down as like, no, the world isn't physical. It is just that the physical is ideas of God, because, again, effectively, we're weirdly splitting hairs, especially if we're all being mental and it's necessarily mental about it. Then why am I not just mentally or practicing this in words, a la Wittgenstein, calling this the material then and just admitting it's mental as well, which is what I'm full doing from my perspective with you. You know, I'm saying, well, the material is mental like Hegel, and I'm going to be very Hegelese and stuff. So really, these are different positions that do weirdly and interestingly argue, and hopefully you can see the differences, but also see how they're kind of not getting out of reality or really pinning it down one place or the other. And I am presenting it that way on purpose. If it does seem like these are useless motions going nowhere, hopefully you can see how it fleshes out angles that will be important later, and I swear it will. Hopefully you have learned something from this, as far as how you look at apples and other things. And then these pieces are going to be important for thinkers, Germans, French, Americans, Brits also, and others. The people who are important, yes? People with money, power, and printing is what I mean. Nothing else is important unless you're directly talking to those people, and then they're the most important people in the world, and should be. So, Barkley basically does say reality consists of minds. He refers to them as spirits. So this is all spirit, mind of God. As physical, knock knock, Spinozian almost reality. Although he is panentheistic, Barkley puts the mind of God safely above and outside of all this, as also physical reality. He is concerned with looking too much like Spinoza. He's not going to be accused of that as a bishop. Again, the official position of the Anglicans and the Catholics is panentheism, not pantheism. This is separately God is throughout all this. This is not directly God, just bare God itself. Or it is as much as God needs it to be. So while we have no direct experience of other minds, we believe them, Barkley argues. This is again why I bring up solipsism. Solipsism is the position is that I'm only real. Other people may not have minds. They may not be conscious. Only I know that I am conscious, which is sort of, as Wittgenstein says, an undefeatable kind of bookend, but we don't treat reality that way, which is interesting to think out. And we are confronted by that occasionally, although maybe not as manically or sort of sociopathically or sci-fi as all of that all the time. But in the same way, we are convinced very much and are that others are conscious. Our consciousness is set up very much to convince us that others are conscious. As I like to say, as psychologists, many a psychologist has blown up a paper bag, drawn a face on it, and popped it in front of the class to show the class that they are afraid kind of or find it hilarious because you feel for the bag if you draw and you watch the person draw a smiley face on it, pop it, you feel sad for the bag. That's because we feel for other things as if they're intelligent or, or let's say conscious. Very much, that they're sentient, that they are experiencing things. We are very set up to be social like that. So if we do see a table jumping and singing, we suspend disbelief. It is alive, effectively. For the purpose of the fiction, that table is a feeling thing. If it started whimpering, we would sympathize with the table, even as we're looking at a cartoon table, which we should know as adults, of course, and we do plenty. It's silly, but we know also that's not a real thing, but we would feel bad showing children, hurt tables getting kicked enough, because, again, that would actually be bad for the kid, weirdly. So Descartes would, again, possibly laugh at our sympathy for the table. Maybe beating tables in front of children for Descartes is good practice. Never said that before. Not going to think that one out too much. So Barkley's not a solipsist. He actually is arguing, of course, we can't be, and he's using that wedge to drive us towards God being all of this. You'll notice, actually, Barkley's position is opposite the solipsist, something fierce. He's like, no, all of this is consciousness, not just this, and you're afraid of everything else. No. He's like, solipsism is the worst wrong position, because actually I'm implying nothing like that projected similarly outward is true, because it's all conscious. You may as well expect entirely out of your head, anti-solipsistic. Is what he's saying. This is, again, I like to say it's difficult to be skeptical, as people have said, when you get kicked in the shins. And it is that you're going to put your mind out there and believe in beings, rather snap automatically. So good luck maintaining the solipsism, of course. But that is, of course, empirical. That isn't necessarily structural nor deductive. That is just, watch it not happen plenty. So Barkley does argue, we had the stalactites and stalagmites with the Stoic. Barkley argues that the order and beauty of nature is evidence, empirical evidence, because he's an empiricist, that God is real there and intelligent and has ideas and this world is designed. And so thus, he says this is the dream of an intelligent being. And we can know that empirically through our experience. That would be how he'd have to get to it, wouldn't it? Because of how he set things up already, as we have. Because we experience all things as ideas, and I will argue against that eventually, but let's not. I am going to argue that we don't treat rocks like ideas. I'm going to explicitly do that with Wittgenstein, but I'm not going to do that right here. But I do want to plant that idea. Barkley says, because we experience all things as ideas, I disagree, but let's not say that entirely. We are not, but we're also, Barkley says, we can't will the world or apples to exist or not. So this, he says, we know is an idea. We know this is mental, but I can't will my fist to exist or not. We know this has to be God's idea. That's what he argues. He argues that we know this has to be an idea. I'm not like think exist. I've been doing a lot now with different things. I don't want this to be a finger snap. Damn it. And I'm the one doing it. Why can't I make this chirp like a bird? Damn it. He's like, that is the sort of thing. I've been using this with Zen a lot. It's like it's visual, it's audible, it's tactile. Which one was first? Which one was there all along? And then listen. Bang. With that, he is actually arguing in a certain sense. You can actually see with those sorts of things also that this has to be the mind of God because it's such an idea, but it's right there smack. It's mind. And I would argue, for that to be a finger snap, it has to be mind because I can't think it into existence or out of existence. Damn it. That has to be the mind of God. Now, that's not obviously, I definitely think that's the mind and the brain and all of it. Of course, that is the safe social science answer and philosophy answer. That's the mind and plenty of that. Barkley's actually like Nicholas of Cusa and Hegel later would say, if you look at a circle that goes round and round, must be part of your soul and mind is immortal. To know that, which is, Piaget and all of this hasn't explained that entirely, I don't know. But basically, I'm not arguing that. And similarly, Barkley says, no, this right here, being mental means this is all mental, which means this is not your will mental, therefore this is all God. Panentheistically, not just God's mind directly, but God's thoughts directly, and then God gets to recede into the tabernacle, with himself, herself, let's not pronoun, proactively. And again, it's like, yes, and then God gets to be God's self privately, as well as this is all public thoughts of God, I suppose, as our physical world. That's what Barkley is arguing, and it's fascinating and amazing. Again, thinking of the 1700s, and Europe, specifically Ireland. So reality is the idea of God, more powerful than our own, which is why Hume is right, that when we imagine things, they're weaker than real, imaginary tigers, weaker than a real tiger for just this reason. And my hand is really my hand here, snapping whether I like it or not for just that reason. So Barkley argued against Locke's distinction between objective primary qualities and subjective qualities using similar examples that the Pyrrhonian skeptics used against dogmatism and Hume borrowed to use against rationalism. Barkley argues that the qualities Locke took to be objective and physical are also themselves subjective and mental. I have done the same. So I'm actually on his side as far as that. Very much already have. And he knows, along with the Greek skeptics I like as well, whom I use, he says Sextus, the Pyrrhonian, mentioned, and Descartes knows of him, pointed out that when one has not yet entered a bathhouse, one does not feel cold, but then after a warm bath, one feels cold exiting the bathhouse. Locke used a similar example of placing one's hand in a warm or cold bucket of water, arguing that this demonstrated that heat is a secondary subjective quality. Barkley uses similar examples to attack Locke's primary qualities. It's smart to use Locke's own example. Oh, that's secondary. He's like, well, then squares can be variously experienced, right? Hazy squares, something. He doesn't say here, but, well, then that means vague squares means not so objective, right? Like warmer or colder water, right? Would be what he would, and that'd be powerful to use Locke's own reasoning against him, would be very powerful in argument. He says Locke has primary qualities of motion and length. Again, that's Newton, but not Einstein, as I said. And he shows them to be subjective and dependent on the position and disposition of the viewer. Basically, the ancient Greek skeptics say a sailboat looks like it's moving fast or slow depending on how far away it is to you, which it does. And they would use that to say time and space are relative, which of course is not Newton. It isn't, it's not Newton or Einstein. That actually is a different kind of relativity for them. But it does sort of prefigure in weird ways where what Barkley is saying, but then he's not even saying something non-Newtonian like Einstein, but that all could be, in a sense, modeled off of or seen an extension of all of that. Is the speed of the thing, which is actually sort of the speed between your fingers as you're watching it more here, is different depending on how fast. So that the slow boat looks very slow, kind of on the horizon. Up next to you, it's going like, a whole bunch of speed. Way off, it is going barely at all, is what they're talking about. That isn't technically, again, anti-Newtonian, but it's sort of, again, I could hear it both ways here. You know what I mean? They're technically not thinking in terms of that. That would be much, somewhat later plenty. And again, 1800s, early 1900s, and Einstein and such. Which is German, again, and all that. The German 1800s, again. And we're getting there soon. Berkeley also argued against Locke's friend Newton, arguing that, again, time and space, thus, are subjective and relative. But again, here, he means it in a way that I'm not saying is Einstein is, thus, yes. Sort of, but not exactly. Which you could go either way. That's prefiguring or not the same thing. And I know just that much and not more about that. So, as a final thought, I do just have to say, being a Berkeleyan, and again, this is Barkley Town, and again, not to endorse any narcotics use in order to stimulate thought at all, but the late American comedian Bill Hicks, and you can watch the documentary about his life and whether or not he does drugs responsibly, and much love, because again, he is one of the great comedians. Don't do drugs to think, you know what I mean, and all that. Seriously, get sober work done. Has a routine. And I'm not going to police, lives any kind of way here, about how he says, as part of a routine he does that is part of his famous comedy routines, in one of my favorite lines of his, and I love comedy, is that he says, we always hear negative stories about drugs. Like somebody tried to fly off the roof or something. And he's like, try to fly from the ground first, jerk. You're ruining, all the dangerous drug use for the rest of us. Like you can ruin the dangerous, crazy drug use. But he says there, he's like, today a young man, on unmentionable stuff, realize that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration. This is a good drug story on the news being announced. Ladies and gentlemen, today, a young man realized all matter is merely energy in a slow vibration. We are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we are the imagination of ourselves. Now here's Tom with the weather. And I do know that Bill Hicks, was interested in philosophy a lot. I'm sure he probably perused, and Austin is apparently where he very much hung out. That is known as the Berkeley of Texas. At least it has been said to be. And again, much love all across the state lines and stuff. So in a certain sense, it's again, Linklater films where he talks to people. He wanders around Austin talking to interesting people. If you have not seen Slacker, again, it's kind of amazing. But that said, and all obscenity and sex and drugs aside and everything fun on the weekends, because this is, it's the weekend, but not that one right here. That again, that does sound a lot like he is perusing Barkley as well as a bit of Taoism perhaps. And of course he read religion and philosophy and he thought it was all hip. And Bill Hicks says a lot that suggests, and in fact he continued to when he moved to London to do his routine, not for Americans, but for British folks who liked his routines and his caustic cynicism about America a lot. Of course, across the pond, is he did consistently say, until his dying days, that he did suggest that we're all dreams very much in something. He very much said over and over again, we are living dreams in the mind of God. So in other words, it is appropriate to close and say Bill Hicks was very much the Berkeleyan and Barkeleyan, whether or not he called himself that. So much love, much happiness. Again, hopefully that was all entertaining and interesting. Again, American entertainment, and this in every other town. So all through the airwaves and the cosmic mind, again, hopefully learned a thing or two. We are going to continue with the Germans again, as and then we will get after the German idealism to the German pessimism. And remember, we are not all puppy dogs and sunshine, Mr. Burns. So yes, much happiness. I'm going to pick back up with some Kant and Hegel. And again, I will see you, ideally, in the bigger dream, if I ever see or imagine you.